I'm Rosemary Armeo, and you're listening to On the Brink, my podcast. Not long ago, Amnesty International came out and said definitively, Israel is committing a live-stream genocide in Gaza. Now, the American Jewish Committee rejected that. They called the conclusion baseless, and they put out a lengthy defense of Israel, saying it was acting only in self-defense to end terrorism, not a population. So my question today is, which is it? Why is it important to label the violence that no one disputes is raging in the Middle East at all? And what does the debate, not less the violence, say about us as human citizens of the world? And for answers, I am turning to Sally Fleschner of Boston. She is one of those fascinating people I met during a lifetime as a journalist here and abroad, whom I promised to introduce you to in this podcast. She is a lawyer, an expert in rule of law, judicial reform, and drafting legislation. She has done work in Palestine, Kosovo, and Bosnia, where I met her, and in Somalia. She teaches classes at Brandeis on war and ethnic cleansing in former Yugoslavia. And she's also found time with all of this to be a champion animal advocate, a world traveler, and a talented cook. You've got to look at her biography when we post it to get a sense of why I love spending time listening to her. She is passionate on this topic of genocide, as well as knowledgeable. So, Sally, can we begin, please, by having you tell my listeners something about your time living and working in Ramallah, which is not Gaza, but a Palestinian enclave on the West Bank of Jordan. That's also under attack right now by Israel. When was this, and what were you doing there with the Ministry of Justice?
Okay, my job in Ramallah was probably my third overseas job. In Bosnia, where I went for 2 months and stayed 5 years, and then and doing rule of law. And my job in Ramallah was to do institution building with the Ministry of Justice. And I had an office in the ministry, and I was supposed to figure out how I could improve them. And I had never been there before. I didn't really know much about the region. You want to know about, well, I'll tell you. My whole image of Israel before I went there was this little tiny country fighting the big bad Arabs and Paul Newman and the movie Exodus. When I got there, it was very romantic, but I got there and what I saw was it was very different. It was kind of horrible. And I lived and worked in Ramallah. A lot of the international people, doing their institution building from Europe and other places, lived in Jerusalem because they thought Ramallah was too dangerous. I don't know. It wasn't. But it was more difficult to live there because you had to go through checkpoints. And there were certain aspects that were very difficult. And I got to see a lot of it because I had a car, and I had a car with yellow plates, which means Israeli plates. So you could go pretty much anywhere. And I did see a lot of what was going on in the West Bank, of the settlements. And this was in 2008 to 2010. My understanding is it's much worse now. I went back in 2017 on with a group for a protest in the South Hebron Hills. And I would tell people when I came back what I saw. And for the most part, people don't want to hear about it. But I saw villages that had been bulldozed. I saw crops that were burned. I saw acres of olive trees that were cut down by the military. I don't know why they even would do these things other than the fact that they could. But I do feel, and when I went on the protest in 2017, I went with the Center for Jewish Nonviolence. And there were 130 of us. I was the only Christian. And we joined up with Israelis and Palestinian activists. We cleaned out some caves. It's sort of work camp kind of stuff. And it was more or less to make us feel good. I don't know if we ever accomplished anything. And the one thing that put it on the map is when the soldiers came in and started pushing people around, and they tore down a tent and destroyed the equipment. So that got it into the newspaper. But it just continues. And my understanding, it just gets worse and worse and worse.
Sally, a lot of what you're describing sounds like a movie that won the Oscar this year, No Other Land. That movie is having a very difficult time being shown in the United States. It cannot get into theaters, but you have seen it. And moreover, you attest to a lot of what it's showing, the Israeli military ravaging the West Bank.
Yeah, I mean, and then they drove them into the caves, then they drove them out of the caves. This was all shown in the movie, the bulldozing of the villages. The only two things in that movie that I never saw was a settler he shot a Palestinian man. And there was another scene where some Israeli settlers beat up another Palestinian kid, and he ended up being paralyzed from the neck down. I never saw that. I never saw the violence. But I did see what the Israelis had done to these villages.
Do you think this is a movie that should be shown and seen in the United States, or is it more of people who didn't want to hear the eyewitness accounts from you?
I think there's a lot of people that just don't want to know. I mean, when I came back, I would tell people, and they didn't want to know, or they would argue with me. And after a while, I just got tired of trying to tell people about what was going on when they really just didn't want to know. Wow. And I find it now, they don't. That's why I wrote that response to the American Jewish Committee. That article that they wrote infuriated me because people believe it. And that's why I wrote the response, because it's all a pack of lies.
Right. You sound like many a war correspondent who gives up trying to make people care about horrible things that they ought to care about. But let's talk about the American Jewish Committee. They rose to the defense of Israel. After Amnesty said this is definitely a genocide, they go, no way. And your response is quite eloquent. It's 2 pages. I probably should put that up online too for my listeners to hear. And in it, you talk about how genocide appears to be very simple. The committee makes it sound like it's just a black and white matter, but that is very complicated and it comes in different forms. Can you talk about that for a minute?
It's any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. And then they mention killing people, causing serious harm, and, inflicting terrible conditions, and they list a whole bunch of things. So that sounds simple, but what's tricky is the intent. And it's not always easy to pinpoint. But with Israel, they made so many comments about what they were going to do. For me, the intent was just laid out. So the American Jewish Committee said, well, there were a few, they were angry and upset over October 7th. And okay, but if someone's accused of murder, it's not a defense that you're angry or you're upset.
Right.
And then they said there were few unfortunate comments made, after October 7th. And I'm not diminishing how awful October 7th was, but it was certainly predictable given the decades of the way the Palestinians had been treated and suppressed by the military or the Israelis, and they had all the weapons and the guns. So there were a number of comments. I think there were a total of about 500 comments made, sort of genocidal comments made by leaders or members of politicians. And I had written in my article, maybe 10. The most significant one was Gallant, and he said, no food, no fuel, no water is going into Gaza. They're human animals, cockroaches. So there were others,
Who is Gallant first? Tell my listeners who Gallant is.
He's a general, and he left and he had a falling out with Netanyahu and he was head of the IDF or something like that.
So he's a high-ranking military official who was saying they're cockroaches.
He is up there.
Yeah.
And there were the famous ones are Ben Gvir and Smoldrich, and they're the ones. And recently I read that they're members of the Knesset who are, want to starve all the Gazans out, just starve them to death, which, it's not just shooting them, but they want them to, it's torture to die of starvation. And the people that are hit first are the babies and the children. And these Knesset members, they don't care. So anyway, so there are all these killing, about killing all the Palestinians, or how they're worms and stuff. And so this is what's hard to find in a genocide, but there are lots and lots of comments made.
Okay, so let's drill down into that. What the Nazis did to Jews and other minority populations in Europe, that was a genocide. First degree, second degree, third degree?
Okay, well, I was going to get to that, but just let me finish this one thing about that they have to act on it. I mean, you can say it, but if you don't do anything. So they acted on it. They stopped the humanitarian aid. Before October 7th, there were 500 trucks a day going into Gaza because Israel controlled everything going into Gaza. And then they dropped down to, right after Gallant's statement, they dropped down to 27 trucks. Then they began to increase them, and then they decreased them. And now they've stopped all humanitarian aid and food, I think, since the beginning of March. And so I don't know how this is going to play out. It doesn't look like it's good. But I think it's a pretty clear case that there was intent and they carried it out. And then there were Israelis that wouldn't let the trucks go in, or Israelis would pull the drivers out of the trucks and beat them up. I mean, this has been not just comments, but acting on the comments. So now I'll say, but the AJC excused all of this on the grounds of proportionality, and I'll get into that.
Right. I was going to ask about that.
You want that, or you want that? Huh?
I was going to ask about proportionality. You need to define that for people.
Okay. It essentially is that the number of civilians who perish has to be proportionate to a legitimate military objective. And so they were saying that the number of, 50, 60,000 Palestinians dead was proportionate to Israel's legitimate under international law. They kept saying under international law, and aim in eradicating Hamas. And I think it's a bit extreme, but I wasn't going to argue with them about that. Now, you asked about the different degrees.
Right.
Okay.
Like the Holocaust is widely regarded because of the scope and the length and the extreme tortures as the God, it sounds horrible, the best genocide, the most effective genocide. First degree genocide?
And the kind of genocide, or at least with these two groups, I think the Israelis would be very happy if all the Palestinians just went away. And Hamas probably would be very happy if the Israelis went away. So if they would just go away, they wouldn't kill them. And I see this as just a different kind of genocide.
Okay.
Or genocidal intent, I'll put it that way. But it's still genocide. And then more recently, ethnic cleansing has been considered genocide. Mm-hmm. And put it in at that category. And, we have a lot of instances of that around the world.
Bosnia was ethnic cleansing.
Yeah, that's where the term came from Bosnia. Mm-hmm. So it looks simple, when you read just the two sentences, but it's very complicated when you begin to analyze it.
Okay, I'm going to go back to, I've asked this now, this is my third time, sorry to press on it, but I'm going to bring up the Holocaust again, because that's an Israeli talking point. How would we people who suffered the worst of all genocides, how could we be committing it? How could we have that intent? It's almost used as a protection against a charge.
Well, it's almost like we should be excused.
Right.
And I think it's irrelevant. And I said that. I said, bringing up the Holocaust has nothing to do with what's going on here. The Palestinians did not cause or participate in the Holocaust. And I had thought, and maybe after World War II and the Geneva Accords and so forth, that maybe this would not continue to happen, but it does continue to happen. It happened in Bosnia, it happened in Rwanda, it happened in Cambodia. And now it's happening in Gaza. So I think it's irrelevant if you're a victim.
You realize that you're sounding like an anti-Semite and a pro-terrorist, at least according to Israeli talking points, their Israeli point of view.
Well, I can't help that. I mean, I think I'm telling the truth. I thought, it was very deceptive when they said, okay, and, Hamas was committing genocide against Israel, which isn't really true. And I don't think the people at AJC really understand the difference between a genocide and terrorism.
That's interesting. That's interesting, Sally. You've said that terrorism has completely different goals than genocide. Talk about that.
Yeah, the terrorists want to instill fear. Genocidal, whatever they are, genocidists want to kill people. They want to destroy an entire population. I'm troubled by just using the term terrorist because a lot of countries will designate a group of people as terrorists, people that they don't like. And we're certainly good at that.
Yes.
But Hamas is a terrorist group the way Al-Qaeda was a terrorist group. Al-Qaeda was not committing genocide against the United States when they, bombed the World Trade Center. It's just a different animal with different objectives.
And to be clear, you're not condoning one over the other. I think we have to say that.
They're just different. Yeah. And you treat them differently. Well, I don't have any answers on how to deal with terrorists either, but I certainly, but I think the genocide is just the worst behavior that human beings can have, whether they want the people out of the territory or they want to kill them all or what. It's just, I don't know, the worst aspect of human behavior.
You've talked about watching children die by starvation, which in many ways is worse than gassing people.
Well, yeah, because it's torture to die by starvation. I saw a photograph, 20 babies that had starved to death. It's gross. Mm-hmm. And I don't understand these Knesset members that are saying, let's starve them out. I just don't understand how people could be so monstrous.
And how about America now? We have been staunchly allied with Israel. We punish people who even speak out against Israel and in favor of Palestinian survival. We're supplying them arms, all kinds of support. We are supporting now attacks on the West Bank, which also has nothing to do with Gaza. Are we committing genocide?
Well, we're certainly complicit if we're selling them all the weapons to do it. But, in my response to the American Jewish Committee, I gave all these examples of murders by Israelis against Palestinians that have nothing to do with proportionality.
Right.
It's mostly soldiers, or also settlers can also be soldiers, who are going to people's homes and they murder them in their homes, they murder them in the fields. When I was in Ramallah in 2008, the Quaker grandmothers would come down from England and help harvest the olives so the settlers wouldn't shoot the Palestinians if there were internationals there. I think people are still doing that. And the Center for Jewish Nonviolence sends Jewish representatives to help harvest the crops in the fall. So there are a lot of murders or killings in the West Bank, and they were never a part of this fight. Hamas never had a presence in the West Bank. and they were exclusively Gaza. And then there were other things. It was the starving babies, and then there were a bunch of teenagers that were brought into the hospitals, and one of the doctors who came to the United States said these kids were killed, shot in the head by Serb sniper, by
You're getting your
Israeli
genocidal venues mixed up here, Sally.
The snipers. And and they're using them as human shields to go in first in places that are dangerous.
That's a charge that Israel makes against Hamas, that they're using their citizens as a shield, and so they are responsible for civilian casualties. You're saying Israel is doing.
And in these detention camps, and 50 of them have died. And if you see the pictures of what they look like for the ones that were released in this prisoner exchange, they're all like starving to death. And I think there were one or two people were gang raped in these detention camps. And, and then you don't hear anything more about it. So the most recent outrage were the 15 medics that were murdered, and they were buried along with their trucks. And first Israel denied it, and then
they lied about it.
Well, this is par for the course. And I'll tell you, one place I get a lot of information is Haaretz. And I used to read Haaretz when I lived there. It's like the New York Times of Israel. And they're not in favor with Netanyahu. And the articles that they write, I think they like to embarrass the Netanyahu government, which is not hard to do if you read Haaretz. But it's not carried here in mainstream media. We're not seeing all this awful stuff. We're really not.
Yes. Thank you. You've come back to the United States. The public does not really know what's going on. If you speak up, as students have around campuses for Palestine, you are punished, even deported, we're seeing. And we continue to supply arms and other support to Israel. We see them as allies in maybe even a wider war in the Middle East. What's been the cost of our alliance with Israel? We have talked about this. We've alienated Arabs. We've alienated many Europeans. And we have hurt a lot of people. What's the pluses of being close allies and friends with Israel?
I think today I'm finding it hard. I'm not sure I understand it. It's just so awful. It is so awful. And the denial that I see here of what's going on is heartbreaking.
Sally, you have said you do not foresee a good ending for the Middle East. Is there no way to turn things around at this point?
Well, they seem determined not to let any food in. People are going to die. The babies die, then the children die first. And, now UNRWA, is not permitted to operate in Gaza.
That's the UN Organization for Humanitarian Aid for Refugees.
Yeah, and I think there were 30,000 UNRWA workers in the region total, and I think the Israeli government had identified 9 or 10 or 12, or I don't know how many were Hamas operatives, and I don't know. I think it came down to 1 or 2 that actually may have been participating in Hamas. But out of 30,000, and given how the Palestinians have been treated all this time, I'm surprised it's so few. And they've all been fired. But that, it's funny. There was a council of Jewish, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim clerics that went.